In the next 2 hours, you'll discover the man behind the miracles, the doubts behind the divine, and the heartbreak behind the hope. Wait until you hear what Jesus says about whether he was actually violent during the temple cleansing. You won't believe his biggest regret about asking his disciples to abandon everything. The moment he admits to feeling like both a hero and a tyrant will shock you. This is the only interview like this you'll ever hear. Jesus speaking not as doctrine, but as a man. Like this video if you're genuinely enjoying it, and subscribe for more groundbreaking conversations with history's most fascinating figures. Which historical figure would you most want to share tea with? Drop your answer below. I read every comment from fellow history lovers like you, and your suggestions inspire future episodes. Now let me hand you over to Olivia, who's traveled back in time to a quiet hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee with Jesus of Nazareth. So dim your lights, get comfortable, and close your eyes. This is Tea with Tyrants and Heroes.
Now, Jesus, the name of this show is Tea with Tyrants and Heroes, so I have to ask you directly. Do you consider yourself a tyrant or a hero? And I want you to really justify your answer. Don't give me the easy response. Tell me why you believe that about yourself.
That's a question that cuts right to the heart of everything, doesn't it? People want simple answers, saint or sinner, good or evil, tyrant or hero. But I've lived in the messy middle of human existence, and the truth is more complex than any label. If I'm being completely honest, there are moments when I wonder if I was both. A hero? Perhaps when I think of the blind man dancing in the streets after seeing his first sunrise, or the way Mary Magdalene's whole countenance changed when she realized she was worthy of love and forgiveness, those moments when I could take someone's deepest pain and transform it into joy. Yes, in those moments I felt heroic. But a tyrant? I've wrestled with that too. I demanded everything from my followers. I asked fishermen to abandon their nets, tax collectors to give up their wealth, families to be willing to love me more than each other. I spoke of bringing not peace but a sword, of dividing households. Is it heroic to ask people to sacrifice their entire lives for your message, or is it tyrannical? I remember the day I told the rich young ruler to sell everything and follow me. I watched his face crumble as he walked away, and part of me wanted to call out, "Wait, 50%, we can negotiate." But I didn't. I let him go, knowing that half-hearted commitment would ultimately destroy him more than the pain of that moment. Was that love or cruelty, heroism or tyranny? The cleansing of the temple, now there's a moment that haunts me. I made a whip and drove out the money changers, overturning tables, shouting about my father's house being turned into a den of thieves. I was furious, absolutely livid at the corruption I saw. But in that anger, I was physically violent. I caused financial loss to people who might have had families depending on that income. Hero or tyrant? I think the answer is that I tried to be a hero, but the cost of heroism sometimes requires tyrannical decisions. Every time I healed someone on the Sabbath, I was being tyrannical toward religious law, but heroic toward human suffering. When I forgave sins, I was being tyrannical toward the established religious order, but heroic toward broken souls. The most tyrannical thing I ever did was choose to die. That sounds backwards, doesn't it? But think about it. I chose to create a debt of love that would burden every human being who ever lived. I made it impossible for anyone to say they weren't worth dying for. That's a terrible gift to give someone, the knowledge that they're so valuable that God himself would rather die than live without them. It's tyrannical because it demands a response, heroic because it guarantees eternal love. So my answer: I was a hero who sometimes had to use tyrannical methods to save people from tyrannical systems. I was tyrannical toward pride and heroic toward humility, tyrannical toward religious pretense and heroic toward genuine faith. Perhaps the real question isn't which one I was, but whether my tyranny served love or power. I hope it always served love.
That's such a profound way to think about the complexity of leadership and love. And since we're sharing tea together, do you actually like English tea?
You know, this blend is absolutely wonderful. There's something about the ritual of sharing a warm cup that transcends any particular culture. In my time, we had wine for celebration and water for sustenance. But this tea, it's like a hug in a cup, isn't it?
I love that. A hug in a cup perfectly describes why tea is so comforting. Now, this is something people have wondered about for 2,000 years. What was your actual relationship with Mary Magdalene? The curiosity around this has never died.
Mary, she is extraordinary. The relationship people speculate about comes from a deep human need to understand love in familiar terms, doesn't it? But what Mary and I shared was something that transcended the categories that people usually think in. When I first met her, she was broken in ways that went far beyond the 7 demons the scriptures mention. She'd been used, discarded, told she was worthless so many times that she believed it in her bones. I remember the first time she looked directly into my eyes. Most people either stared in awe or looked away in shame, but Mary looked at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. She was the first person who seemed to see both the divine and human in me simultaneously. Was I attracted to her? If we're talking about the magnetic pull of one soul recognizing another, then absolutely. Mary had this incredible mind. She could grasp spiritual concepts that left even Peter scratching his head. She'd ask questions that made me think differently about my own message. If you're really offering new life, she once asked me, why do you seem so sad all the time? That stopped me in my tracks. Physically attracted. My human nature wasn't absent just because of my divine nature. Mary was beautiful, but more than that, she was present in a way that most people weren't. When she listened, her whole being listened. When she laughed, it was like music. When she cried, which was often in those early days, it was with such honesty that it made me want to hold the whole world more gently. But here's what people don't understand about love in the context of my mission. I was called to love everyone with that same intensity. The agony wasn't in loving Mary. It was in having to love Judas with equal depth, knowing he would betray me. It was in loving the crowds when they shouted, Hosanna, and loving them just as much when they screamed, Crucify him. Mary understood this in a way the others didn't. She was also the only one who truly believed I'd returned from death. The night before my arrest, when I was trying to prepare them all for what was coming, the men kept arguing about who'd be greatest in the kingdom. Mary just sat quietly, and when I caught her eye, she nodded slightly. She knew. She understood that this wasn't the end, but a beginning. The morning of my resurrection, I appeared to her first, and people have wondered why. It wasn't because she was my wife or lover in the conventional sense. It was because she was the one who had enough faith to be looking for me. The others were hiding, mourning, assuming it was over. Mary was at the tomb because she refused to believe that love could be defeated by death. Did I want to stay and build a life with her? Every human fiber in me wanted that. I wanted to wake up next to her, to grow old with her, to have children who had her eyes and her questions. But I also knew that kind of exclusive love would have diminished the universal love I came to demonstrate. Mary understood this too, which is why she let me go. Our relationship was romantic in the truest sense. It was about the romance of two souls recognizing each other across the vastness of existence. It was about spiritual intimacy that made physical intimacy seem small by comparison. She knew me, and I knew her, in ways that touched eternity.
The way you describe that love and sacrifice, there's such beauty and pain there. This leads me to something else people search for constantly. Why did you really have to die? Couldn't an all-powerful God have found another way?
That question, it's kept me awake more nights than I can count. And yes, before you ask, the Son of God did lie awake questioning the plan, especially in Gethsemane when I was sweating blood and begging for any other way. Take this cup from me, I pleaded, because in that moment I wasn't thinking like God. I was thinking like a 33-year-old man who didn't want to be tortured to death. Could my Father have chosen another way? Theoretically, yes. God could have simply declared humanity forgiven, could have sent angels to fix everything, could have snapped divine fingers and reset the world. But here's what I've come to understand about the nature of love and justice. Some things can only be healed by entering into them, not by standing outside and fixing them. Think about human relationships. When someone you love is betrayed, you can't heal that wound by simply saying, "I declare you unbetrayed." The healing comes from someone proving that not everyone will betray, that love is stronger than betrayal. But you can only prove that by putting yourself in a position where betrayal is possible and choosing love anyway. Humanity's deepest wound wasn't just that they'd done wrong things, it was that they believed they were unworthy of love. Every human being carries the secret conviction that if people really knew them, really saw their thoughts and failures and selfishness, they'd be abandoned. The only way to heal that wound was for someone to know everything, every dark thought, every shameful moment, every failure, and choose to die for them anyway. But here's the part that breaks my heart when I remember it. It had to be real death, real suffering, real abandonment. In those hours on the cross, I experienced every form of human anguish simultaneously. Physical pain, yes, but that was almost nothing compared to the emotional and spiritual agony. I felt the weight of every lie ever told, every act of cruelty, every moment of despair. I experienced the abandonment that every abused child feels, the loneliness of every widow, the fear of every person facing death alone. My Father didn't abandon me because he stopped loving me. He had to withdraw so I could fully experience what separation from divine love feels like. Because until you've been in the pit, you can't really pull someone else out. Until you've felt forsaken, you can't comfort the forsaken. The resurrection wasn't just about proving I was divine, it was about proving that death doesn't win. Every human being lives with the terror that death makes everything meaningless, that love ends, that consciousness simply stops. I had to go all the way through death and come out the other side to prove that love really is stronger than anything. But there's another layer that people don't often consider. Free will required that humans have the power to reject love, to choose evil, to cause real harm. My Father couldn't just override free will without destroying the very thing that makes love meaningful, but he also couldn't let evil win permanently. The cross was the place where divine justice and divine mercy met, where the consequences of evil were fully absorbed by love itself. I had to die because someone had to demonstrate that love is willing to pay any price, endure any suffering, face any darkness for the sake of the beloved. And once that demonstration was made, once that price was paid, no human being could ever again say they weren't worth dying for. The real question isn't why I had to die, it's why I was willing to. And the answer is simple: because I'd rather die than live in eternity without you.
That explanation of love willing to pay any price, it's overwhelming to think about. Now, here's something people often wonder. What do you consider your biggest mistake during your time on earth?
My biggest mistake? That's a question that makes my chest tight even now. People expect me to say I made no mistakes because of my divine nature, but my human experience was full of moments I wish I could handle differently. The mistake that haunts me most isn't what you might expect. It was the day I sent the demons from the possessed man into the herd of pigs, and they ran off the cliff and drowned. Everyone focuses on the dramatic healing, the man restored to his right mind, the demons cast out. But I watched 2,000 pigs die that day. I heard their squealing as they plunged into the sea, saw the terror in their eyes. Those were God's creatures too, innocent animals who suffered for human spiritual warfare. The pig herders lost their livelihood that day. These weren't wealthy landowners, they were probably hired hands who'd now have to explain to their masters why an entire herd was dead. Some of them might have had families depending on that income. Children who'd go hungry because I chose to solve one man's problem by creating problems for others. I could have cast those demons into the abyss directly. I could have destroyed them completely. But in that moment, I was so focused on the man's freedom, so moved by his years of suffering, that I didn't think through the full consequences of my method. The demons asked to go into the pigs, and I said yes without considering that they'd destroy the animals they entered. What makes this my biggest mistake isn't just the immediate consequences, it's what it revealed about the complexity of love in action. Every miracle I performed had ripple effects. When I healed people on the Sabbath, I disrupted the religious order that many people depended on for meaning and stability. When I forgave sins, I threatened the authority structures that gave certain people their identity and purpose. The rich young ruler I mentioned earlier, that was another profound mistake. I could see his heart, see that he genuinely wanted to follow me, but I gave him the one command I knew he couldn't follow: sell everything and give to the poor. I watched hope die in his eyes as he walked away. What I should have done was meet him where he was, given him a path to gradually loosen his grip on wealth rather than demanding immediate perfection. But with the pigs, it was different. It was thoughtlessness masked as divine authority. I acted in haste and justified it later. The worst part is that the healed man became an outcast in his own community because of the economic devastation my miracle caused. They begged me to leave their region, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid of what my next miracle might cost them. I learned something important that day about the weight of power. Every ability I had to heal, to teach, to change lives came with the responsibility to consider not just the intended outcome, but all the other lives that would be affected. The pigs taught me that even divine love must be exercised with human wisdom. The mistake I carry most heavily isn't one of commission, but of omission. There was a leper colony outside Jerusalem that I passed many times but never visited. I was always on my way somewhere else, always focused on the crowds or the disciples or the religious leaders. I could have healed every single person there with a touch, could have given them their lives back, their families back, their dignity back, but I was too busy, too focused on my larger mission. I think about them sometimes, the ones I could have helped but didn't, the suffering I could have prevented but was too preoccupied to notice. That's the mistake that weighs on me most. Not the wrong things I did, but the right things I left undone because I was human enough to have limited attention and time. The irony is that people want me to be perfect, but perfection without the possibility of error isn't really an achievement, it's just programming. My mistakes were proof of my humanity, and my humanity was essential to my mission, but that doesn't make them hurt any less.
The weight of those decisions, especially about the leper colony, you can hear the regret in your voice. But let me ask about the flip side. What made you angriest during your ministry? What really set you off?
Anger. Yes. I felt it burning in my chest more often than people comfortable with their sanitized version of me would like to admit. But what made me angriest wasn't what most people expect. It wasn't the prostitutes or tax collectors or sinners that the religious people loved to condemn. It wasn't even the Romans, though their cruelty was breathtaking. What made me absolutely furious, what had me clenching my fists and raising my voice until my throat was raw, was watching religious leaders use God's name to crush people's spirits. I remember this one particular Sabbath in Capernaum. There was a man with a withered hand in the synagogue, born that way, probably struggled his whole life to find work, to feel useful, to believe he had value. The Pharisees didn't see him as a person. They saw him as a test case. They were watching me, waiting to see if I'd heal on the Sabbath so they could accuse me of breaking the law. The man was sitting there, hope flickering in his eyes as he looked at me, and these religious leaders were literally hoping I wouldn't heal him because it would mess up their theological argument. They would rather see him suffer for another day, another week, another lifetime, than risk having their understanding of Sabbath law challenged. That's when I lost it. I looked around at them with anger. The text says, grieved at their hardness of heart. But in that moment, I was livid. I could feel heat rising up my neck, my hands shaking with rage. These men who claimed to speak for God were actively hoping for human suffering to continue because it served their religious agenda. Is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath? I asked them, my voice probably louder than necessary. To save life or to kill? They wouldn't answer because they knew any answer would expose their hypocrisy. So I healed the man right there, in front of everyone, and watched them immediately start plotting how to destroy me for showing compassion on the wrong day of the week. But that wasn't even the worst of it. What made me angriest was the systematic way they kept people from God while pretending to bring them closer. They created hundreds of rules that had nothing to do with loving God or loving people. Rules about hand washing, about how far you could walk, about what you could carry, about who you could eat with. They turned relationship with God into a performance evaluation. I watched ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, merchants, walk away from synagogues feeling like failures because they couldn't keep up with all the regulations. People who genuinely loved God but weren't educated enough to understand complex theological debates were told they were spiritually inferior. Widows were manipulated into giving their last coins to the temple while their children went hungry. The money changers in the temple weren't just running a business, they were running a scam. They charged exorbitant exchange rates to convert Roman money into temple currency, then charged inflated prices for sacrificial animals. Poor families saved for months to afford a temple sacrifice, only to be told their lamb wasn't good enough and they'd have to buy a temple-approved one at 3 times the price. When I made that whip and overturned those tables, I wasn't just angry about commerce in the temple. I was furious about systematic exploitation of people's desire to worship God. They were getting rich off people's spiritual hunger, creating barriers between people and God instead of building bridges. But the thing that made me angriest, the thing that still makes my jaw clench when I think about it, was how they treated children. They would shoo children away from me like they were bothering an important adult. "Don't waste the teacher's time," they'd say. The disciples did it too sometimes, until I had to tell them to let the children come. What they didn't understand is that children were the whole point. Children love without condition, trust without evidence, forgive without hesitation. They're everything the kingdom of heaven is supposed to be about. But these religious leaders saw them as distractions, interruptions, future projects rather than present treasures. My anger wasn't petty or selfish. It was the rage of love confronting systems designed to prevent love from flowing freely. Every time someone used religion to diminish rather than elevate human dignity, every time someone made God seem smaller instead of bigger, every time someone placed rules above relationship, that's when I couldn't stay calm anymore. The irony is that my anger often got me labeled as rebellious or dangerous, when really it was the anger of someone who loved people too much to watch them be crushed by systems that claim to represent divine love.
That righteous anger comes from such a deep love for people. But let me ask about something more vulnerable. What were you afraid of? What kept you up at night with anxiety?
Fear. That's something people don't want to think about when it comes to me, isn't it? They want me to be this serene, unflappable figure who never worried about anything. But the truth is, I was afraid of so many things it sometimes felt like fear was my constant companion. My biggest fear, the one that woke me up in cold sweats, was that I'd fail. Not fail at miracles or teaching, those came naturally. I was terrified that I'd fail to accurately represent my Father's heart to humanity. What if people looked at me and came away with the wrong impression of God? What if my human limitations obscured the divine love I was trying to reveal? I remember lying awake after particularly difficult days, replaying conversations in my mind. The woman at the well, did I say too much too quickly? The rich young ruler, was I too harsh? Thomas with his doubts, was I patient enough? Every interaction felt like it carried eternal weight because people weren't just meeting Jesus of Nazareth, they were meeting their picture of what God was like. The fear of misrepresenting my Father was absolutely paralyzing sometimes. I'd wake up thinking, what if they remember my tiredness and think God gets tired? What if they remember my frustration and think God is impatient? The pressure of being the human face of divine love was crushing. But there were more immediate fears too. I was terrified of the cross long before Gethsemane. People focus on that final night of prayer, but the truth is, I'd been having anxiety attacks about my death for months. Not just the physical pain, though that terrified me, but the spiritual separation. I'd never been apart from my Father, never experienced even a moment without that connection. The thought of being cut off, even temporarily, felt like contemplating the destruction of my very identity. I was afraid of letting down my disciples, These men had given up everything to follow me, their jobs, their families, their security. What if I wasn't worth that sacrifice? What if my death left them feeling foolish and abandoned? I'd watch them sleeping around our campfire and feel this crushing responsibility for their futures, their faith, their lives. Physical pain terrified me more than I liked to admit. I'd seen crucifixions. We all had. I knew exactly what awaited me. The nails, the suffocation, the slow agony that could last for days. My human body recoiled from that knowledge. Sometimes I'd catch sight of my hands and imagine nails being driven through them, and I'd have to stop walking until the nausea passed. I was afraid of being forgotten, not in the sense of historical memory. I somehow knew that wouldn't be a problem. But I was afraid that the real me, the person behind the miracles and teachings, would be lost. That people would turn me into a religious symbol rather than remembering me as someone who loved them enough to laugh with them, cry with them, share meals with them. The responsibility of knowing the future was its own form of terror. I knew Judas would betray me, but I couldn't stop loving him or remove him from our group without corrupting the whole purpose of free will. I had to love him fully while knowing he'd destroy me. I knew Peter would deny me, but I couldn't protect him from that pain without preventing his growth. I knew all of them would abandon me in my darkest hour, but I couldn't prepare them without changing their choices. I was afraid of my own power sometimes. When I felt anger rising in me, I was terrified of what I might do. I could have called down fire from heaven, could have struck people dead with a word, could have forced compliance through fear. The temptation to use divine power to solve human problems through force was constant, and resisting it required more energy than any miracle. But perhaps my deepest fear was that love wouldn't be enough. What if, after everything, the incarnation, the ministry, the cross, the resurrection, people still chose hatred over love, division over unity, power over service? What if I gave everything and humanity didn't change? That possibility haunted me because it would mean my Father's heart would continue to break over his children's choices. The anxiety was worst in the quiet moments. When the crowds went home and the disciples were asleep, when it was just me and the vast night sky and the weight of carrying God's love for every human being who ever lived or ever would live, that's when the magnitude of what I'd taken on would hit me, and I'd have to remind myself to breathe, to trust, to remember that love really was stronger than fear. Even now, thinking about those moments, I can feel my chest tightening. Fear wasn't the opposite of my divine nature. It was part of what made my love real. You can't truly love someone without fearing for them, can't truly sacrifice without being afraid of what it will cost.
Hearing about those fears makes you so much more relatable, so much more human. Let's shift to something lighter. What's your happiest memory from your time on earth?
Oh, that's easy. The wedding at Cana, but not for the reason you might think. Yes, that was my first miracle, turning water into wine, but what made it my happiest memory wasn't the miracle itself. It was watching my mother's face when she realized what I'd done. You have to understand, Mary had been carrying the secret of who I was for over 30 years at that point. She'd had angels appear to her, had given birth to me in supernatural circumstances, had treasured all these things in her heart. But for 3 decades, I'd been just her son, helping Joseph in the carpentry shop, getting splinters in my fingers, probably tracking mud through her clean house. When the wine ran out at the wedding, I could see the panic in the host's eyes. Running out of wine at a wedding wasn't just embarrassing, it was a social catastrophe that could affect his family's reputation for years. My mother came to me with this look of complete confidence and said, "They have no wine," not "Can you help?" or "What should we do?" Just a simple statement that somehow contained absolute faith that I would handle it. But when I hesitated, when I said, "Woman, my hour has not yet come," I saw something flicker across her face. Not doubt exactly, but this moment of wondering if she'd misunderstood something fundamental about who I was supposed to be. Had she been wrong all these years? Had the angel's message been a dream after all? So I did it. I told the servants to fill the stone jars with water, and I turned that water into wine. But here's what made my heart sing. It wasn't just good wine, it was extraordinary wine, better than anything they'd served all evening. The master of the banquet was amazed, saying they'd saved the best for last, but I was watching my mother's face the whole time. When she tasted that wine, when she realized what had happened, her expression went through this incredible transformation. First surprise, then recognition, then this radiant joy that seemed to light up the whole courtyard. It was like watching someone finally exhale after holding their breath for 30 years. She started laughing, not just chuckling, but this deep, bubbling laughter that made everyone around her start smiling, even though they didn't know why. She caught my eye across the crowd and gave me this tiny nod as if to say, "There you are. I knew you were in there somewhere." That moment contained everything beautiful about human joy. The relief of the host who wouldn't be humiliated, the delight of wedding guests who suddenly had the best wine they'd ever tasted, the celebration of a young couple beginning their life together. But mostly it was my mother's vindication. 30 years of faith finally confirmed, her quiet confidence finally rewarded. What made it even more special was that it was such a small, domestic miracle. I could have started with healing lepers or raising the dead, something dramatic and unmistakably divine. Instead, my first public act was making sure a wedding party didn't run out of wine. It was about joy, celebration, community, the simple pleasure of sharing good food and drink with people you love. The whole evening had this magical quality. Children were running around between the tables, their laughter mixing with the music. Old people were telling stories that grew more elaborate with each cup of wine. Young couples were dancing with the unconscious grace of people who aren't worried about how they look. Everyone was happy in that simple, uncomplicated way that's actually quite rare. I sat with my disciples, still new then, still figuring out what they'd gotten themselves into, and watched them experience their first miracle. Philip kept staring at his cup like he couldn't believe what he was drinking. Andrew was grinning so widely I thought his face might split. Even Judas was genuinely happy that night before the weight of his future choices started eating away at his joy. But the best part was toward the end of the evening, when my mother came and sat beside me. She didn't say anything about the miracle, didn't make a big production of it. She just sat there, her hand resting lightly on my arm, and said quietly, "The bride looks so happy." In that moment, I felt the perfect alignment of my divine purpose and my human heart. This was why I'd come, not primarily to perform miracles, but to increase joy, to make life more abundant, to turn ordinary moments into sacred ones. The miracle was just the method. The joy was the point. That night, falling asleep on a borrowed mat in a house full of happy strangers, listening to the distant sound of celebration still echoing in the courtyard, I felt more purely content than at any other moment in my earthly life. Everything was exactly as it should be. Love was being celebrated, community was being strengthened, and my mother finally knew for certain that her extraordinary faith had been worth it.
That image of your mother's face, that vindication of 30 years of faith, it's beautiful. Speaking of faith, what do you wish people understood about faith that they seem to miss?
Faith. Oh, where do I even begin? People have made it so much more complicated than it needs to be, and yet somehow missed how radical it actually is. What I wish people understood is that faith isn't about certainty. It's about trust in the midst of uncertainty. The disciples are perfect examples of this. People hold them up as these pillars of faith, but they doubted constantly. Thomas wanted to touch my wounds after the resurrection, but even before that, they all had moments of complete bewilderment. When I was sleeping in the boat during the storm, they were absolutely terrified, shaking me awake and demanding to know if I cared that they were about to drown. But here's what made their faith real. They kept following me anyway. Faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's choosing to act on love even when doubt is screaming in your ear. It's Peter stepping out of the boat knowing he might sink. It's the woman with the bleeding disorder pushing through a crowd despite her fear of being discovered. It's the Canaanite woman persisting in asking for her daughter's healing even when I initially said no. What breaks my heart is how religion has turned faith into a performance metric. People think they have to have perfect belief, unwavering confidence, constant spiritual feelings. So they fake it. They pretend to be more certain than they are, more peaceful than they feel, more joyful than their circumstances allow. They turn faith into a mask instead of an honest relationship. Real faith looks much messier than that. It looks like the father who brought me his epileptic son and cried out, "I believe, help my unbelief." That man understood something profound. Faith isn't about having enough belief. It's about being honest about how little belief you have and asking for help anyway. I wish people understood that questions don't threaten faith, they deepen it. The disciples asked me everything. Why do you speak in parables? Who can be saved? What will happen when you die? Can we call down fire on these people who rejected us? Their questions weren't evidence of weak faith. They were evidence that they were taking this relationship seriously enough to wrestle with it. But there's another side to faith that people miss entirely. Faith is dangerous. Real faith doesn't make life easier, it makes life more challenging. It calls you to love your enemies, to give sacrificially, to forgive repeatedly, to trust when circumstances suggest you shouldn't. Comfortable faith isn't really faith at all, it's just religious insurance. I think about the rich young ruler again. He wanted to follow me, but when I told him to sell everything and give to the poor, he walked away sad. His problem wasn't lack of faith. He believed I was who I said I was. His problem was that he wasn't ready for faith to cost him everything. Real faith always costs everything, though what it gives back is infinitely more valuable. Faith is also much simpler than religious people make it. It's not about understanding complex theology or following elaborate rituals. Some of the strongest faith I encountered came from people who couldn't read, who knew nothing about scripture, who had never set foot in a synagogue. The centurion who asked me to heal his servant from a distance, he understood authority and trust in a way that impressed me more than all the religious education of the Pharisees. What I wish people really grasped is that faith is a gift, not an achievement. You can't work up enough faith through effort or discipline. You can't earn it through good behavior or lose it through bad behavior. It's given freely to anyone who's honest enough to admit they need it and humble enough to receive it. The saddest thing I see is people who are afraid they don't have enough faith, so they avoid me altogether. They think faith is like a membership card they have to earn before they can approach God. But faith is more like learning to swim. You don't wait until you're a strong swimmer to get in the water. You get in the water and swimming happens gradually, with lots of splashing and probably some panic. Faith is also deeply personal and completely communal at the same time. Each person has to choose it for themselves. No one can believe for someone else, but it grows best in community, surrounded by other people who are also learning to trust, also struggling with doubt, also discovering that love really is stronger than fear. What I want people to know is that wherever they are in their relationship with faith, whether they're drowning in doubt, angry at God, confused by circumstances, tired of trying, or just beginning to wonder if there's something more, that's exactly where I meet them. Faith isn't about having it all figured out. It's about being willing to take the next step with whatever light you have, trusting that more light will come when you need it.
That understanding of faith as trust amid uncertainty really reframes everything. Now, this is something that's fascinated people for centuries. Tell me about Judas. How did it feel to love someone you knew would betray you?
Judas. His name still makes my chest ache in ways I can't fully describe. People want to paint him as purely evil, as if he was some kind of monster from the beginning. But that makes the whole tragedy less meaningful, doesn't it? The truth is much more heartbreaking and much more human. I loved Judas, not past tense. I love him still. I chose him to be one of my 12 closest companions, knowing exactly how our story would end. Every morning when he'd wake up and smile at me, every evening when he'd count out our common purse with such careful attention, every time he'd ask a thoughtful question about the kingdom, I knew, and I loved him anyway. That's what made it so excruciating. If Judas had been obviously evil, obviously wrong for the group, the betrayal would have been easier to bear. but he was brilliant. He understood economics and politics in ways that the other disciples didn't. When Mary of Bethany poured expensive perfume on my feet, it was Judas who pointed out that the money could have been used to help the poor. He wasn't wrong about that, even though his motives were mixed. What people don't understand is that Judas's sin wasn't being bad, it was being disappointed. He wanted me to be a different kind of Messiah than I was called to be. He wanted political revolution, economic reform, the overthrow of Roman occupation. He believed in me, but he believed in his version of me rather than who I actually was. I could see the disappointment growing in his eyes over those 3 years. Every time I chose mercy over justice, healing over fighting, love over power, I was failing to meet his expectations. The night he went to the chief priests wasn't really about the 30 pieces of silver. It was about forcing my hand. He thought if I was arrested, I'd finally unleash my divine power and establish the earthly kingdom he was convinced I was hiding. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was watching him realize what he'd done. In the garden, when he kissed my cheek and I said, "Friend, do what you came to do," I could see the exact moment when he understood that I wasn't going to fight back, wasn't going to call down angels, wasn't going to be the Messiah he'd imagined. But here's what destroys me when I think about it. If he'd stayed, if he'd watched the resurrection, if he'd been there when I appeared to the others, he would have understood. The kingdom I came to establish was bigger than anything he'd imagined, more revolutionary than any political movement. But he couldn't bear the weight of what he'd done long enough to see how the story ended. People ask me why I didn't stop him, why I didn't expose him to the other disciples, why I let him handle the money when I knew he was stealing from it. The answer is the same reason my Father doesn't stop any of us from making destructive choices. Love requires freedom, even the freedom to choose wrong, even the freedom to cause enormous pain. Every time Judas took money from our purse, it was a small betrayal that prepared him for the larger one. Each theft was him choosing his desire over my mission, his comfort over my calling. But each time, I hoped he'd recognize what he was doing and choose differently. I kept hoping until the very end. The night of the Last Supper, when I said, "One of you will betray me," I watched his face. For a moment, just a moment, I thought he might confess, might ask for forgiveness, might choose differently. But he didn't. He asked, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Knowing it was, and I said, "You have said so." Even then, I was giving him one last chance to change course. What torments me most is that I failed him, not in the cosmic sense. His betrayal was necessary for the salvation plan, but in the personal sense, I failed to love him in a way that convinced him he was worth more than 30 pieces of silver. I failed to show him that his dreams of revolution could be fulfilled in ways he couldn't imagine. I think about him often, wondering what our conversations in eternity will be like. Will he understand then why I had to die? Will he see that his betrayal, while genuinely evil in its motivation and devastating in its consequences, was woven into a larger tapestry of redemption? Will he forgive himself, or more importantly, will he finally accept my forgiveness? The hardest part of loving Judas was that it taught me something about divine love that I wish I hadn't had to learn. Sometimes love means letting people break your heart completely because the alternative is controlling them in ways that would destroy the very thing you love about them. Judas's freedom to choose, even to choose betrayal, was part of what made him beautiful and human and worth dying for.
The pain in your voice when you talk about Judas, it's clear that love really does make betrayal more devastating, not less. Let me ask you something completely different. If you lived today, how do you think you'd use social media and modern technology?
You know, this question makes me smile because I can just picture the disciples arguing about who gets to manage my Instagram account. Peter would want to post only the biggest miracles. Look what Jesus did today. While John would focus on the poetic moments, probably way too many sunset photos with deep captions about light and darkness. But seriously, the possibilities are both exciting and terrifying. On one hand, imagine being able to reach billions of people instantly with a message of love and hope. No more walking from village to village, no more depending on word of mouth to spread the good news. I could sit on a hillside and broadcast the Sermon on the Mount to the entire world simultaneously. The democratization of communication would fascinate me. In my time, religious teaching was controlled by educated elites who could read and interpret scripture, but social media means anyone can share their spiritual insights, their questions, their struggles. A fisherman in Galilee could have the same platform as a high priest in Jerusalem. That leveling of the playing field is very much in line with the kingdom values I taught. I think I'd probably be most active on platforms that allow for longer, more thoughtful content. Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, might be too constraining for the kind of teaching I did, though there's something appealing about distilling complex spiritual truths into memorable, shareable phrases. Love your enemies would definitely go viral, though probably with a lot of angry quote tweets. The ability to reach marginalized communities directly would be incredible. Instead of depending on religious gatekeepers to decide who gets to hear my message, I could speak directly to people who feel excluded, overlooked, or condemned by religious institutions. LGBTQ+ youth, immigrants, people struggling with addiction, sex workers, all the modern equivalents of the sinners and outcasts I spent most of my time with. But the dark side would be overwhelming. Can you imagine the comment sections on my posts? The death threats in my DMs? The way my words would be taken out of context, edited, weaponized? People already do that with scripture that's been carefully preserved for 2,000 years. Imagine what they do with real-time social media content. The comparison culture would be brutal too. People would be constantly measuring their spiritual lives against curated highlights from other believers. Look how peaceful this person is, versus, why am I still struggling with anger? The pressure to present a perfect spiritual image would make authentic faith even harder to maintain. I think I'd have to be very intentional about showing vulnerability and struggle. I'd probably post about my own moments of doubt, my bad days, my frustrations with religious hypocrisy. Not to diminish my divine nature, but to remind people that spiritual growth is a process, not a destination. The misinformation problem would be staggering. People would create fake accounts claiming to be me, spreading messages that contradict everything I actually taught. There would probably be conspiracy theories about my miracles being special effects, my teachings being ghost-written by political operatives. The amount of energy required just to combat false information would be exhausting. But I think what would sadden me most is how social media tends to flatten nuance and complexity. My parables worked because they forced people to think, to wrestle with meaning, to come to their own conclusions. But social media rewards quick, simple answers and punishes anything that requires contemplation. The algorithm would probably suppress my content for being too long, too complex, too challenging. I'd probably use stories and live videos a lot. Real-time healing services, Q&A sessions where people could ask anything, behind-the-scenes content with the disciples. Imagine a live stream of the feeding of the 5,000, or a TikTok of me walking on water, though I suspect people would just assume it was CGI. The global reach would be incredible for organizing acts of service and justice. Instead of just teaching about caring for the poor, I could coordinate worldwide efforts to address hunger, homelessness, inequality. Social media's power to mobilize people for causes could be transformative if used with wisdom and love. But ultimately, I think I'd struggle with the same thing that challenges everyone on social media. How do you maintain authentic relationships when so much communication is performative? The most important part of my ministry was the intimate conversations, the one-on-one moments, the quiet times when people felt safe to share their deepest fears and hopes. No amount of followers or engagement could replace that. So I'd probably use social media to cast a wide net. But the real work would still happen in private messages, video calls, small group meetings, wherever people felt safe to be fully themselves without worrying about how it would look to others.
The idea of you navigating Twitter comments is both hilarious and sobering. Now let me ask about your relationship with your father. People hear father and son, but what did that actually feel like from your perspective?
The relationship with my father. It's the hardest thing to put into human words because there's no earthly equivalent that even comes close. Imagine the most perfect parent-child relationship you can conceive of, then multiply it by infinity and add dimensions that don't exist in human experience. That's still just the starting point. From my earliest memories, there was never a moment when I couldn't sense his presence, his voice, his heart beating in rhythm with mine. People talk about prayer as this difficult discipline, this reaching across distance to connect with God. But for me, not praying would have been like holding my breath, possible for a while, but ultimately impossible to maintain. Our communication wasn't usually in words the way humans think of conversation. It was more like, imagine if you could feel someone's emotions as clearly as your own, if you could know their thoughts the moment they formed, if every desire of your heart was perfectly aligned with theirs. That's what it was like most of the time, a constant flowing communion that was deeper than language. But here's what people don't expect. We disagreed sometimes, not about fundamental truth or ultimate goals, but about methods, timing, approach. In the wilderness during my temptation, when Satan offered me all the kingdoms of the world, part of me wanted to take that shortcut. I could have saved humanity without the cross, without the suffering. My father and I had some intense discussions about that. The most difficult conversation we ever had was in Gethsemane. People read, "Take this cup from me," and think it was a quick prayer before I accepted my fate. But I was there for hours, wrestling, arguing, pleading. I wanted him to find another way. I showed him all the alternative plans I'd been thinking about, ways to accomplish redemption without the agony of crucifixion and separation. What if I just live a perfect life and teach people how to love? I asked. What if I demonstrate divine power in ways that convince everyone? What if we start with a smaller group, build gradually, avoid confrontation with the religious authorities? We went through dozens of scenarios, and each time he gently showed me why they wouldn't work, why only complete sacrifice would break the cycle of sin and death. The hardest part was that he felt the cost as deeply as I did, maybe more. People think God the Father was somehow detached from my suffering, that he coldly watched his son die for some cosmic purpose. But divine love means feeling every pain your beloved feels. When I hurt, he hurt. When I was afraid, he was afraid. The difference was that his perspective encompassed not just my temporary suffering, but the eternal joy that would follow. During my ministry years, our relationship was like having the wisest, most loving advisor always available. Before every major decision, choosing the 12, planning the journey to Jerusalem, deciding how to respond to criticism, I'd check in with him. Sometimes he'd give clear direction. Other times he'd let me figure it out, knowing that my human wisdom guided by divine love would find the right path. The strangest part was learning to be both fully dependent on him and fully responsible for my choices. Divine sonship didn't mean being a puppet. I had to choose obedience moment by moment, had to wrestle with temptation, had to grow in wisdom and understanding. My divine nature didn't override my human development. It worked through it. But the absolute worst moment, the one that still makes me shudder when I remember it, was those hours on the cross when he turned away. For the first time in my existence, the connection was severed. The constant presence that had sustained me since before the world began was suddenly absent. That's when I cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It wasn't just loneliness. It was the complete dissolution of my primary identity. Who was I without my Father's presence? How could I exist in a universe where that connection was broken? For those hours, I experienced what every human being experiences: separation from God, cosmic loneliness, the terror of being truly alone with suffering. He had to withdraw so I could fully experience what sin does. It separates us from divine love, but also so that when I broke through death and rose again. Every human being could know that even the worst separation can be healed. Even the deepest abandonment can be transformed into reunion. The resurrection morning was like, imagine being dead and suddenly alive, but also imagine being partially deaf and suddenly hearing music, being partially blind and suddenly seeing color. When our connection restored, it was deeper and richer than before because it now included the experience of what it felt like to be without it. What I want people to understand is that this relationship, this perfect love between father and son, isn't something exclusive to us. It's the template for what divine love wants to create with every human being. The intimacy, the trust, the perfect communication, the shared purpose that's available to everyone who's willing to receive it. My relationship with my father wasn't meant to be unique, it was meant to be the prototype.
That description of losing and regaining that connection, it's almost beyond comprehension. Since your resurrection and ascension, what do you miss most about being fully human?
Physical sensation, believe it or not. People think of the resurrection body as this upgrade that eliminates all the inconveniences of human existence, but there were things about physical limitation that were actually beautiful in their own way. I miss being tired in that bone-deep way that comes from a long day of walking dusty roads, then experiencing the profound relief of finally sitting down and feeling your muscles relax. There was something about the contrast, the weariness that made rest so sweet, the hunger that made simple bread taste like a feast, the thirst that made cool water feel like a miracle. I miss the vulnerability of sleep. Now I exist in constant awareness, eternal vigilance, perfect knowledge of everything happening everywhere all the time. But there was something precious about surrendering consciousness each night, about trusting that the world would keep spinning while I was unconscious, about waking up refreshed with that momentary confusion about where I was. The sensory limitations were actually gifts in ways I didn't realize at the time. I could only see what was in front of me, could only hear conversations happening nearby, could only touch what was within reach. That forced presence, that focused attention, created intimacy that omnipresence makes more difficult. When I was talking to someone, they had my complete attention because I literally couldn't be aware of everything else happening simultaneously. I missed the anticipation of food when I was really hungry, the way your mouth would water when you smelled bread baking, the way your stomach would growl and make the disciples laugh. I miss the social ritual of meals, not just the feeding of the 5,000, but the intimate dinners where we'd linger around the table long after the food was gone, talking and laughing and sometimes arguing about theology. Physical affection is different now too. When I was human, a hug felt like something, the warmth of another person's body, the pressure of their arms, the way it could make sadness feel lighter or joy feel bigger. I could ruffle children's hair and feel the soft texture, could put my hand on someone's shoulder and sense their tension releasing. Physical comfort had a weight and presence that spiritual comfort, while more powerful, somehow lacks. I miss the process of learning things gradually. Now I know everything instantly, completely, perfectly, but there was something beautiful about the way understanding would dawn slowly, the way I'd puzzle over a parable's meaning or work through a theological problem step by step. The aha moments, the gradual illumination, the journey from confusion to clarity, that was its own kind of miracle. Weather affected me then in ways it doesn't now. I remember being genuinely cold in the mountain air, pulling my cloak tighter and being grateful when we found shelter. I remember the relief of shade on a scorching afternoon, the way rain felt when we'd been traveling through dry country for days. Physical discomfort made physical comfort feel earned, deserved, significant. I miss laughing until my sides hurt. Divine joy is profound and eternal and perfect, but it doesn't make your stomach muscles ache or bring tears to your eyes. There was something about human laughter that was pure gift, the way it would start with someone telling a ridiculous story about their day and spread until all 12 disciples were gasping for breath. The imperfection of human communication was actually beautiful too, the way people would struggle to find words for deep experiences, the way a gesture or expression could convey more than sentences, the way misunderstandings could lead to deeper understanding. Now communication is perfect, instantaneous, complete, but it lacks the charming awkwardness of people trying to connect across the gap of separate consciousness. I miss the way human relationships required work. Friendship wasn't automatic. It had to be built through shared experiences, through choosing to forgive small annoyances, through learning each other's personalities and preferences. The effort made the intimacy more precious. Divine relationships are perfect and eternal, but they lack that sense of achievement that comes from building something beautiful together. Most of all, I miss the way hope felt when the future was genuinely uncertain. Yes, I knew the ultimate outcome of my mission, but there were thousands of smaller moments when I genuinely didn't know how things would turn out. Would this person believe? Would that crowd listen? Would the disciples understand? The tension between hope and uncertainty created a kind of excitement that omniscience eliminates. Don't misunderstand. I wouldn't trade my current existence for human limitation. The ability to be present with every believer simultaneously, to answer every prayer, to work on universal scales of redemption, it's indescribably wonderful. But sometimes when I see humans experiencing their first taste of really good wine, or falling asleep in each other's arms, or laughing at something completely silly, I remember how sweet those simple pleasures were when they were all I had.
That nostalgia for physical sensation and uncertainty, it makes perfect sense when you put it that way. Now, looking at Christianity today, churches, denominations, televangelists, how do you feel about what's been done with your message?
Oh, this question. It's like watching your children grow up and make choices you didn't expect. Some of them make you incredibly proud, and others break your heart, and most of the time you're feeling both emotions simultaneously. Let me start with what fills me with joy, because there's so much of it. I see churches running food banks, building homeless shelters, sending medical teams to disaster zones. I see believers adopting orphans, fighting human trafficking, providing clean water to villages that have never had it. I see small groups gathering in living rooms to study my words and actually apply them to their lives, supporting each other through cancer treatments and job losses and family crises. There's a little church in Bangladesh where they've taken in dozens of children whose parents died of AIDS. And they're not just caring for them, they're giving them education, hope, futures. There's a pastor in Detroit who sold his mansion and moved into the inner city to live among the people he serves. There are Christians in China who are willing to go to prison rather than stop sharing my message of love. This is exactly what I hoped would happen. But then there are the things that make me want to weep. I see pastors getting rich by promising prosperity to people who can barely afford groceries while they buy private jets and call it God's blessing. I see churches splitting apart over carpet colors while homeless people freeze outside their doors. I see my name used to justify hatred, exclusion, political power grabs, and nationalism. The worst part is when people use my words to do exactly what I opposed. I spent my entire ministry challenging religious leaders who cared more about rules than people, who built barriers instead of bridges, who used their authority to control rather than serve. And now I see that same spirit wearing Christian labels, claiming to speak for me while doing everything I stood against. The obsession with being right instead of being loving particularly grieves me. I watch denominations argue about baptism methods while children go unfed. I see theological debates about predestination while refugees are turned away. I see arguments about worship styles while marriages fall apart because spouses can't forgive each other. They're arguing about the color of the napkins while the house burns down. The politicization of my message is especially painful. I've been claimed by both conservatives and liberals, both Republicans and Democrats, both capitalists and socialists. They take pieces of my teaching and ignore other pieces, creating a Jesus who agrees with their political preferences rather than challenging them. The real Jesus makes everyone uncomfortable because love always demands more than any political ideology can provide. What breaks my heart most is how often Christianity has become about exclusion rather than inclusion. I ate with tax collectors and sinners. I touched lepers. I defended adulterers. I welcomed children. I praised the faith of foreigners. My whole ministry was about expanding the circle of who gets to belong to God's family. But I see churches that seem more interested in keeping people out than inviting them in. The prosperity gospel particularly infuriates me because it's so completely backwards. I told people to sell what they had and give to the poor, that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. I lived without a place to lay my head. But these preachers tell people that faith guarantees wealth, that poverty is a sign of insufficient belief. They're literally preaching the opposite of what I taught. But here's what gives me hope. The best of Christianity today looks exactly like what I envisioned. When believers prioritize love over doctrine, service over comfort, inclusion over exclusion, they change the world in ways that echo through eternity. When they feed the hungry because I was hungry, visit prisoners because I was imprisoned, welcome strangers because I was a stranger, that's when they're most truly following me. The house churches in persecuted countries often look more like my original vision than the mega churches in free societies. When faith costs something, when following me requires sacrifice rather than promising blessing, believers tend to focus on what's actually essential: love, community, service, hope. I'm particularly moved by Christians who fight for justice even when it costs them politically or socially. The believers who opposed slavery, who fought for civil rights, who work for immigrant rights, who defend the marginalized, they're doing exactly what I would do. They understand that my kingdom is about changing systems that oppress people, not just offering comfort to individuals. What I want modern Christians to understand is that the point was never to build an institution that would last forever. The point was to start a movement of love that would transform every institution it touched. When churches become ends in themselves rather than means to love the world, they've missed the point entirely. The question I want every believer to ask isn't what would Jesus do, but what is Jesus doing and how can I join him? Because I'm still here, still working, still calling people to follow me into the uncomfortable, challenging, beautiful work of loving the world back to life.
That tension between grief and hope in your voice, it really shows how much you still care. During your ministry, how did you handle criticism and rejection, especially from religious leaders?
Criticism and rejection, they were like background music to my entire ministry. There wasn't a day that went by without someone questioning my authority, my methods, my message, or my right to exist. Learning to handle that constant barrage of negativity was one of the most challenging aspects of my human experience. The religious leaders were relentless. They followed me everywhere, not to learn but to find fault. They'd watch me heal someone and immediately start arguing about whether I had the right to do it on the Sabbath. They'd see me share a meal with tax collectors and accuse me of being a glutton and a drunkard. They twisted my words, questioned my parentage, and ultimately plotted my death because they couldn't control me. In the beginning, their criticism stung more than I expected. I'd lie awake at night replaying their accusations, wondering if they had a point. When they said I was blaspheming by forgiving sins, part of me wondered if I was being too presumptuous. When they accused me of breaking religious law, I'd examine my actions to see if there was truth in their charges. But I learned to distinguish between criticism that came from love and criticism that came from fear. The religious leaders weren't concerned about truth or people's well-being. They were concerned about their own power and authority. When someone's criticism is rooted in self-interest rather than genuine care, it carries less weight. The rejection from my hometown of Nazareth was particularly painful because it was personal. These were people who'd watched me grow up, who knew my family, who should have been proud of what I'd become. Instead, they took offense at my teaching. "Isn't this just the carpenter's son?" they said. "Who does he think he is?" That dismissal based on my humble origins cut deep because it was so petty, so human. I developed some strategies for dealing with constant criticism. First, I tried to understand the fear behind the attacks. The Pharisees weren't evil men, they were scared men. They'd built their entire identity around being religious experts, and I was threatening that foundation. Understanding their motivation helped me respond with compassion rather than defensiveness. Second, I focused on the people who were helped rather than the people who were offended. For every religious leader who condemned my Sabbath healing, there was a man who could use his withered hand again. For every critic who questioned my association with sinners, there was a transformed life. The positive impact reminded me why I was there. Third, I surrounded myself with people who believed in me. The disciples weren't perfect, but they provided emotional support when the criticism became overwhelming. Having even a small group of people who understood your mission makes the rejection from the majority bearable. But I'll be honest, there were times when I wanted to give up, when I wanted to go back to carpentry and live a quiet life without constant scrutiny. The night before I chose the 12 disciples, I spent hours in prayer, partly because I was tired of facing opposition alone. Having companions who shared the burden made everything more manageable. The hardest criticism to handle was when it contained a grain of truth. When the Pharisees accused me of being a friend of sinners, they meant it as an insult, but they were absolutely right. I was proud to be known as someone who welcomed outcasts and outcasts. Sometimes criticism reveals something about yourself that you need to embrace rather than defend against. I also learned to use criticism as teaching opportunities. When they accused me of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, I turned it into a lesson about divided kingdoms. When they criticized my disciples for eating with unwashed hands, I used it to teach about what really makes someone unclean. Criticism often revealed the critic's misplaced priorities, which gave me chances to point toward what really mattered. The rejection that hurt most wasn't from enemies, but from friends. When many of my followers turned away after I spoke about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, when I had to ask the 12 if they wanted to leave too, that was heartbreaking. Enemy criticism you can dismiss, but when people you love walk away, it cuts to the bone. I think what sustained me most was remembering that my father had faced the same rejection from the very people he'd created and loved. Criticism and rejection weren't signs that I was doing something wrong. They were signs that I was challenging systems and ideas that needed to be challenged. When comfortable people become uncomfortable, it usually means you're touching something that needs to change. The cross was the ultimate criticism and rejection, the religious and political authorities working together to eliminate me completely. But even there, I tried to respond with forgiveness rather than bitterness. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Understanding that their rejection came from ignorance rather than malice made it easier to bear. What I learned is that if you're going to love people who don't want to be loved, if you're going to challenge systems that don't want to be challenged, if you're going to speak truth that people don't want to hear, criticism and rejection are inevitable. The question isn't how to avoid them, but how to respond to them in ways that reflect the love you're trying to demonstrate.
That wisdom about distinguishing between fear-based and love-based criticism, that's something we all need to learn. If you could go back and talk to your 12-year-old self in the temple, what would you tell him?
12-year-old me in the temple, I was so serious then, so intense about understanding scripture and asking the teacher's questions. I remember feeling this weight even then, this sense that I was different, that I had a purpose I couldn't quite grasp yet. If I could sit down with that earnest boy, there are so many things I'd want to tell him. First, I'd tell him to laugh more. I was carrying the weight of the world even before I understood what that meant, and while that seriousness served a purpose, I wish I'd allowed myself more joy in those early years. Some of my happiest memories are from childhood, helping Joseph in the workshop, listening to my mother's stories, playing with the other children in Nazareth. I'd tell young Jesus to treasure those moments more fully instead of always being pulled toward deeper things. I'd want him to know that the questions that kept him awake at night about suffering, about injustice, about why good people suffer while evil people prosper, those questions were important and would be answered, but not in the ways he expected. I spent so many nights as a child staring at the stars, wondering why my father allowed pain in the world, not understanding yet that he was working on a solution that required my participation. Be gentler with your parents, I'd tell him. Mary and Joseph did their best to understand me, but how do you parent a child who's simultaneously fully human and fully divine? I was probably difficult to raise, asking complicated theological questions at dinner, disappearing to pray when other boys were playing, showing insights that made adults uncomfortable. I wish I'd appreciated more how challenging it must have been for them. I'd tell him that the loneliness he felt, that sense of being different from everyone around him, would make sense later. As a child, I knew I was called to something significant, but I couldn't share that knowledge with my friends. They were worried about normal childhood things while I was wrestling with cosmic purposes. That isolation was preparation for the loneliness of ministry, but it was still hard to bear. Don't be in such a hurry to grow up, I'd say. I was always reaching for adult understanding, adult responsibility, adult concerns, but there was wisdom in the gradual unfolding of awareness that was part of my human development. Some revelations could only be received at the right time, and trying to force them earlier would have been overwhelming. I'd want him to know that the anger he felt about religious hypocrisy, even at 12, I could see the gap between what the teachers taught and how they lived, that anger was righteous and would fuel important work later. But I'd also tell him to be careful not to let anger turn into bitterness or superiority. The religious leaders he criticized were still people created in my Father's image, still worthy of love even when their actions were wrong. Pay attention to the ordinary miracles, I'd tell him. I was so focused on understanding my divine nature that I sometimes missed the daily wonders of human existence. The way sunrise painted the hills around Nazareth, the satisfaction of finishing a carpentry project well, the comfort of my mother's hand on my forehead when I was sick. These were gifts too, not just stepping stones to greater things. I'd encourage him to ask for help more often. Even as a child, I felt this pressure to figure everything out myself, to be strong for everyone around me. But my father wanted relationship, wanted conversation, wanted to guide me through the process of growing up. Some of my most beautiful childhood memories are of times when I finally admitted I was confused or scared and felt divine love surrounding me like a warm blanket. Trust the timing, I'd tell him. Everything in me wanted to begin my ministry earlier, wanted to start healing and teaching and changing the world. Waiting until 30 felt like wasted time when I could see so much suffering that needed addressing. But those hidden years in Nazareth were essential, learning to work with my hands, understanding ordinary human struggles, building relationships with normal people. Those experiences made my later ministry more relatable and authentic. I'd want him to know that the dreams he had about changing the world were both smaller and larger than he imagined. Smaller because the kingdom wouldn't come through political revolution or dramatic displays of power. Larger because the transformation would affect not just his generation but every human being who would ever live. Most importantly, I'd tell him, you are beloved. Even at 12, I was already feeling the pressure of expectations, the weight of purpose, the responsibility of calling. I'd want him to know that before he was the Messiah, before he was a teacher, before he was a sacrifice, he was simply a beloved son. That love wasn't conditional on successful ministry or perfect performance. It was the foundation everything else was built on. And one more thing, I'd tell him, smiling. Learn to enjoy wine and good food now, because people are going to spend centuries arguing about whether it's okay for Christians to have fun. Might as well have the memories to sustain you through the theological debates.
That advice about being beloved before being anything else, that's something we all need to hear. What was the hardest teaching you ever had to give? The one that broke your heart to say?
The rich, young ruler. Without question, that was the teaching that shattered my heart while I was giving it. People focus on the theological implications, salvation by grace versus works, the dangers of wealth, the cost of discipleship. But for me, it was devastatingly personal. This young man ran to me, actually ran. You have to understand, wealthy people in that culture moved with dignity, with measured steps that reflected their status. But this man was so desperate for truth that he abandoned social conventions and ran like a child chasing after something wonderful. the eagerness in his eyes, the genuine hunger for spiritual life. It was beautiful to see. He knelt before me, which again was remarkable for someone of his social standing. Everything about his approach showed authentic humility and sincere seeking. He wasn't trying to trap me like the Pharisees, wasn't testing my knowledge like the scribes. He genuinely wanted to know how to have eternal life, how to be right with God. When he listed the commandments he'd kept since childhood, I could see he was telling the truth. This wasn't boasting. It was a young man who genuinely tried to live righteously his entire life. And you know what the text says? Jesus looked at him and loved him. I loved him. Not past tense, not conditional on his response. I loved him deeply and immediately. That's what made what happened next so heartbreaking. I could see his heart, see the one thing that stood between him and complete surrender to God. His wealth wasn't just money, it was security, identity, status, power, the foundation of everything he understood about himself and his place in the world. I knew that asking him to give it up was asking him to demolish his entire life and start over with nothing but faith. But I also knew that as long as he held on to his wealth, it would hold on to him. He'd always be divided, always torn between serving God and serving Mammon. Half-hearted discipleship would ultimately destroy him more completely than the temporary pain of complete surrender. So I said the words that I knew would break both our hearts. Go, sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. I watched hope die in his eyes. I saw the exact moment when he realized the cost was more than he was willing to pay. His face fell, not angry, not argumentative, just devastated. He'd come expecting to add some religious practices to his existing life, not to hear that his entire life needed to be sacrificed. The text says he went away sad, but it doesn't capture the depth of his grief or mine. I wanted to call after him, "Wait, 50%, we can negotiate." Every fiber of my human heart wanted to make it easier for him, to find a compromise that would let him follow me without giving up everything. But I knew that compromise would be false kindness, that it would leave him trapped between two kingdoms, belonging fully to neither. What people don't realize is that I wasn't just asking him to give up wealth, I was asking him to trust that my Father's love was enough to sustain him. That's the hardest thing to ask of anyone, especially someone who's used to being self-sufficient. I was asking him to bet his entire future on an invisible kingdom, to trade tangible security for intangible hope. The hardest part was that I could see who he would become if he said yes. I could see him transformed from someone who used wealth to buffer himself from the world's pain into someone who experienced the joy of sacrificial love. I could see him finding a richness of purpose that would make his material wealth look like poverty by comparison. But I couldn't force that transformation. It had to be chosen freely. Watching him walk away felt like watching someone choose to remain in prison when the door was wide open. The tragedy wasn't that he was a bad person. He was a good person who couldn't quite become a great person because the cost felt too high. The disciples were shaken because they'd assumed that if anyone could enter the kingdom, it would be someone like him, moral, religious, successful. When I said it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, they asked, "Then who can be saved?" They understood that if wealth made salvation harder rather than easier, all their assumptions about divine blessing were wrong. But here's what breaks my heart most. I knew that somewhere in his future, after years of trying to fill the God-shaped hole in his life with more possessions, more achievements, more status, he'd remember this conversation. He'd realize that the momentary pain of giving up everything would have been nothing compared to the chronic emptiness of keeping everything but missing the one thing that could satisfy his soul. That teaching was hard because it revealed that some people will choose familiar misery over unfamiliar hope. It showed that love can't force transformation. It can only offer it and wait, heartbroken, for the response. Every time I give difficult teachings about forgiveness, about loving enemies, about taking up crosses, I remember that young man. I remember that truth is sometimes a gift people aren't ready to receive, and that the most loving thing you can do is speak it clearly anyway, even when you know it will hurt both of you.
The pain of offering life-changing truth that gets rejected. I can hear it in your voice. This might be controversial, but what are your thoughts on other religions? How do you view different paths to the divine?
This question, it touches something that's both deeply complex and beautifully simple at the same time. People want clear categories: saved versus damned, true versus false, us versus them. But my Father's love is more expansive and mysterious than human theological systems can contain. Here's what I know with absolute certainty. My Father loves every human being He's created with the same intensity He loves me. That love doesn't depend on having the right theological knowledge or belonging to the correct religious group. It flows freely toward Buddhist monks seeking enlightenment, Muslim mothers teaching their children to pray, Hindu mystics pursuing union with the divine, indigenous shamans connecting with creation's rhythms. But here's what I also know. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Not because my Father is exclusive or tribal, but because the path to Him requires dealing with the sin and separation that affects all humanity. I didn't come to establish a religion, I came to restore relationship. Every genuine spiritual seeking, every honest pursuit of the divine, every heart that hungers for transcendence is actually seeking what I came to provide. I think about the Roman centurion who asked me to heal his servant. He wasn't Jewish, didn't have the right religious background, yet I said I hadn't found such great faith in all of Israel. His trust in divine authority transcended his pagan religious context. Or the Samaritan woman at the well. Her people had been rejected by Orthodox Judaism, yet she received some of my deepest teaching about worship in spirit and truth. What moves me most is when I see people in other traditions living out the values I taught without necessarily knowing they're following me. The Buddhist who shows radical compassion to enemies, the Muslim who sacrifices for the poor, the Hindu who seeks truth above personal comfort, the secular humanist who fights for justice. They're responding to my spirit's leading even if they don't recognize the source. But I also grieve when any religion, including Christianity, becomes a barrier rather than a bridge to divine love. When religious systems create pride, exclusion, judgment, or hatred, they're working against everything I came to accomplish. Sometimes the most religious people are furthest from my Father's heart, while those who claim no religion at all are living more truly than those who claim to follow me. The question isn't whether other religions contain truth. Of course they do. My Father has been reaching toward humanity through countless cultures, languages, and contexts throughout history. The question is whether those truths lead people toward the relationship my Father wants to have with them, or whether they become substitutes for that relationship. I see sincere seekers in every tradition who are actually following me without knowing it. When someone chooses love over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, humility over pride, service over selfishness, they're responding to my call regardless of the religious language they use to describe their experience. At the same time, I see people who use my name but live lives that contradict everything I taught. They may have the correct theology, but they're further from the kingdom than many who've never heard my name but live out my values instinctively. The tragedy is when religious boundaries prevent people from experiencing the fullness of divine love that I came to provide. A Hindu mystic who encounters my love but feels forced to choose between that love and their cultural identity is facing an unnecessary barrier. A Muslim who recognizes truth in my teachings but fears rejection from their community is caught between human systems rather than being free to follow divine leading. What I long for is what happened on Pentecost. People from every nation, speaking every language, understanding the same message of love in their own cultural context. Not conversion that destroys identity, but transformation that fulfills the deepest longings every religion tries to address. Here's the mystery that religious systems struggle with. I am both the most exclusive and most inclusive reality in existence. Exclusive because there truly is no other way to the Father except through me. but inclusive because through me is broader than most people imagine. My work on the cross wasn't limited to people who could articulate correct doctrine about it. It was for everyone who ever lived, regardless of their religious background or lack thereof. The thief on the cross didn't have time for baptism, catechism, or joining a church. He simply recognized truth when he saw it and asked to be remembered. That's all anyone needs. Recognition of truth and a desire for relationship. So when I encounter a Sufi poet whose writings about divine love rival anything in Christian mysticism, when I see a Jewish rabbi teaching with wisdom that echoes my own, when I witness a secular philosopher wrestling with questions of meaning and morality, I see my Father at work, drawing hearts toward truth through whatever means those hearts can receive. The goal was never to start another religion. The goal was to tear down the barriers between human beings and divine love, to make relationship possible for everyone regardless of their starting point. Religion at its best points toward that relationship. Religion at its worst creates new barriers to it.
That balance between exclusive truth and inclusive love, it's beautiful and challenging. Speaking of relationship with the divine, what do you want people to know about prayer that they're missing?
Prayer. Oh, where do I even start? People have made it so complicated, so formal, so intimidating. They think they need special language, perfect theology, the right posture, the right location. But prayer is just conversation with someone who loves you more than you can comprehend and wants to hear everything you have to say. The most powerful prayers I heard during my ministry weren't the elaborate, eloquent petitions of religious leaders. They were desperate cries from broken hearts. Help me. Please heal my child. Have mercy on me. I don't know what to do. These raw, honest expressions moved my Father's heart more than all the beautiful liturgies combined. I remember the tax collector in the temple who couldn't even lift his eyes to heaven, just beat his chest and said, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." That was perfect prayer, honest, humble, direct. Meanwhile, the Pharisee beside him was giving God a performance review of his own righteousness, listing all the reasons God should be impressed with him. What people don't understand is that my Father isn't interested in being impressed. He's interested in relationship. When a parent is reunited with a lost child, they don't want a formal speech about the child's gratitude and intentions for better behavior. They want to hold their child close and hear their voice, however broken or imperfect it might be. Prayer doesn't require perfect faith. Some of the most beautiful prayers in Scripture are arguments with God. Why do the wicked prosper? How long will you hide your face? If you're really there, prove it. My Father can handle your doubts, your anger, your confusion. What He can't work with is dishonesty or distance. People worry about asking for the wrong things, as if prayer is a test they might fail. But my Father knows what you need before you ask. The point of asking isn't to inform Him, but to acknowledge your dependence, to maintain connection, to align your heart with His. Even when you ask for things that aren't best for you, He hears the need behind the request and responds to that. The Lord's Prayer that I taught the disciples, people recite it as if it's magic formula, but it was meant to be a framework, not a script. Our Father, recognizing relationship and community, hallowed be your name, acknowledging reverence and worship. Your kingdom come, aligning with divine purposes. Give us our daily bread, expressing dependence and trust. Forgive us and help us forgive, maintaining clean relationships. Lead us away from temptation, requesting guidance and protection. But here's what I really want people to understand. Prayer changes you more than it changes circumstances. When you bring your fears to my Father, He doesn't always remove what you're afraid of, but He gives you courage to face it. When you bring your anger, He doesn't always change the situation that made you angry, but He gives you wisdom to respond differently. Silent prayer is just as powerful as spoken prayer. Some of my deepest communion with my Father happened without words, just presence, just awareness, just love flowing between us. When you're too tired, too hurt, too overwhelmed to find words, just sitting in His presence is enough. He reads your heart better than you understand it yourself. Prayer isn't just asking for things, it's gratitude, worship, confession, listening, wondering, questioning, resting. Some of my most meaningful prayer times were simply appreciating the beauty of creation or feeling wonder at the complexity of human relationships. Awe is a form of prayer. Joy is a form of prayer. Even honest despair is a form of prayer. The timing of answered prayer is often mysterious from human perspective, but perfect from eternal perspective. My Father sees the whole story while you see only the current chapter. Sometimes what looks like delayed response is actually preparation, either preparing the answer or preparing you to receive it wisely. Corporate prayer has a power that individual prayer doesn't. When people agree together, when hearts unite around common concerns, when community forms around shared seeking. But it's not about volume or numbers impressing God. It's about the beautiful resonance of voices joining together, the way individual faith strengthens when combined with others' faith. Don't worry about your wandering mind during prayer. My Father is more patient with your attention span than you are. If you start praying about your sick friend and end up thinking about what to make for dinner, He's interested in both concerns. Your life is all one piece to Him. There's no separation between spiritual concerns and mundane ones. The most important thing I want people to know is that prayer is never one-sided. It's not just you talking to God. It's God responding to you through circumstances, other people, scripture, nature, that quiet inner voice, unexpected peace, sudden insight, open doors, closed doors. Learn to recognize His responses even when they don't look like what you expected. Prayer is breathing for the soul. You don't have to be good at it to benefit from it. You don't have to understand it to experience it. You just have to show up, be honest, and trust that love is listening.
That image of prayer as breathing for the soul, it makes it so much more accessible. As we near the end of our conversation, I want to ask about extremes. What has been your greatest joy and your greatest sorrow?
My greatest joy and greatest sorrow, they're actually the same moment, viewed from different angles. The cross. I know that sounds paradoxical, but let me explain. My greatest sorrow was feeling completely abandoned by my Father for those hours of darkness. I'd never experienced even a moment without His presence, His love, His constant communion. Suddenly, for the first time in my existence, I was utterly alone. The weight of every sin, every act of cruelty, every moment of despair that had ever existed or ever would exist crashed down on me simultaneously. But beyond the spiritual anguish was the human heartbreak. Looking down and seeing my mother's face, watching her heart shatter as she witnessed my suffering, seeing John standing beside her, knowing he'd have to care for her now, hearing the crowd mock me, "If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross," knowing that I could have done exactly that, but that doing so would have meant abandoning every person who needed redemption. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the emotional and spiritual torment, feeling the full weight of human evil without the cushion of divine protection, experiencing what complete separation from love feels like, understanding in my body and soul what every abandoned child feels, what every abused spouse endures, what every person facing death alone goes through. That was my greatest sorrow. Not just my own suffering, but fully experiencing the suffering that human beings inflict on each other and themselves, feeling the despair of every suicide, the rage of every murder, the anguish of every betrayal, the loneliness of every rejection, taking all of it into myself and feeling it without any defense or buffer. But here's where sorrow transforms into joy. In that darkest moment, I accomplished what I came to do. Every barrier between humanity and divine love was destroyed. Every debt of sin was paid. Every person who would ever live gained access to perfect love, complete forgiveness, eternal relationship with my Father. My greatest joy is seeing people discover who they really are, beloved children of God who are worth dying for. When someone realizes that they're not defined by their worst mistakes, their deepest shame, their greatest failures, when they understand that love really is stronger than anything they've done or anything that's been done to them. I think of Mary Magdalene recognizing my voice in the garden and understanding that death hadn't won, of Thomas touching my wounds and whispering, "My Lord and my God," of Peter forgiven despite his denials, restored to friendship and purpose, of Paul transformed from persecutor to apostle, of every person throughout history who's moved from despair to hope, from hatred to love, from death to life. The cross was joyful because it meant no one ever has to be separated from my Father's love again. No one has to carry shame that can't be forgiven. No one has to face death alone. No one has to wonder if they're worth loving. The answer is yes, and the proof is that I was willing to endure complete separation from everything good so they'd never have to. But there's another joy that's ongoing, watching love multiply. Every time someone chooses forgiveness over revenge, I rejoice. Every time someone serves another person at personal cost, I celebrate. Every time someone shows mercy when they could choose judgment. Every time someone includes when they could exclude. Every time someone builds up when they could tear down. That's my joy manifesting in the world. The resurrection morning was pure joy because it proved that love really is the strongest force in existence. Death, the ultimate enemy, had been defeated, but not through violence or power, through love willing to absorb all the violence and power that evil could muster and transform it into redemption. My ongoing joy is seeing the kingdom grow, not through conquest or coercion, but through love attracting love, light drawing people out of darkness, hope growing wherever it's planted. Every marriage healed, every addiction overcome, every relationship restored, every act of justice, every moment of peace, these are all expressions of the victory won on the cross. The greatest joy is knowing that the sorrow was temporary, but the victory is eternal. Every tear I shed, every wound I bore, every moment of agony I endured, it was all worth it to hear my Father say to each person who accepts my love, "Welcome home, beloved child. You never have to be alone again." That's the paradox of divine love. The willingness to embrace ultimate sorrow for the sake of ultimate joy. Not just my joy, but the joy of every person who discovers they're infinitely loved, completely forgiven, and eternally secure in relationship with perfect love.
That transformation of ultimate sorrow into ultimate joy through love. It's breathtaking. Since you've experienced death and resurrection, what can you tell us about what actually happens when we die?
Death. I've experienced it from both sides now, and I can tell you that everything changes the moment your last breath leaves your body, but not in the ways most people imagine. The first thing that happens is relief. All the pain, all the struggle, all the weight that bodies carry in a broken world, it's gone instantly. There's no gradual transition, no slow fading. One moment you're fighting to breathe, and the next moment you're more alive than you've ever been, just in a completely different way. The second thing is recognition. You realize immediately that you're still you, your memories, your personality, your love for the people you've left behind, all of that remains intact. Death doesn't erase who you are. It reveals who you've always been underneath the physical limitations and earthly concerns. But here's what might surprise people. Time works differently there. The moment after death feels both like an instant and like eternity. You're fully present in a new reality, but you're also somehow aware of the entire arc of your earthly life simultaneously. Past, present, and future exist together in ways that human language can't adequately describe. What I experienced during those 3 days was unique because I was carrying the weight of all human sin, experiencing the separation that sin creates. But for those who die in relationship with my Father, death is like stepping from a dimly lit room into brilliant sunshine. Everything becomes clearer, brighter, more real than anything they experienced on earth. The judgment that people fear isn't what they think it is. It's not an angry God reviewing a list of your failures and deciding whether you deserve punishment. It's more like standing before perfect love and seeing yourself clearly for the first time, both your brokenness and your beauty, both your failures and your potential. Some people experience what you might call a life review. but it's not condemning, it's illuminating. You see how your actions affected others, but you also see how love was working through circumstances you never understood. The random kindness you showed to a stranger, the forgiveness you offered when it was difficult, the times you chose love over fear. You see the ripple effects extending far beyond what you ever imagined. For those who know me, death is reunion, not just with me, but with everyone they've loved who went before them, grandparents, friends, even pets. Love doesn't end at death, it's fully revealed. The relationships that seemed broken by death are restored, but in deeper, more perfect ways than they ever were on earth. The physical sensations are indescribable because they're not really physical anymore, but they're more vivid than anything the human body can experience. Colors that don't exist on earth, music that touches your soul directly without going through your ears, peace that doesn't depend on circumstances because there are no threatening circumstances. But here's what people really want to know. What about those who don't know me, who lived good lives but in different religious contexts, or those who struggled with faith, or those who made terrible mistakes? My Father's mercy is larger than human theology can contain. The thief on the cross had minutes to know me, but that was enough. A lifetime of seeking truth, even through other traditions, creates receptiveness to recognizing me when we meet face to face. What breaks my heart is that some people choose separation even after death, not because they're forced to, but because they've become so identified with their independence, their self-sufficiency, their refusal to admit need, that accepting perfect love feels like losing themselves. Hell isn't primarily punishment, it's the logical consequence of rejecting relationship with the source of all life and love. The resurrection body is real but different. I could eat fish with my disciples, let Thomas touch my wounds, walk through locked doors. Physical but not limited by physical laws, recognizable but perfected. Every scar becomes beautiful because it tells a story of love triumphing over damage. For believers, death is graduation, not termination. Everything good they experienced on earth, beauty, love, joy, creativity, relationship, continues but amplified beyond imagination. Everything painful, disease, conflict, misunderstanding, separation, simply doesn't exist anymore. The hardest part about experiencing death and resurrection was coming back to a world where people still had to die. I knew what waited for them, knew that their fears were unfounded, knew that the pain of goodbye was temporary, but I also knew they had to walk through it without my first-hand knowledge to sustain them. Time in eternity includes time on earth, but isn't bound by it. Your loved ones who die don't spend years waiting for you. From their perspective, you arrive immediately, even if decades pass on earth. Love transcends time, and in eternity, all the moments of love you shared exist simultaneously and forever. What I want people to understand most is that death is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the real story. Everything on earth, beautiful as it can be, is just the opening chapter. The best is always yet to come for those who trust in love.
That picture of death as graduation rather than termination. It's so comforting yet challenging. As we approach the end of our conversation, what message do you most want to give to people living in today's world?
To today's world, where my heart breaks and soars simultaneously when I look at what humanity has become. You have technology that can connect someone in rural Africa with someone in downtown New York instantly. You have medical knowledge that can cure diseases that killed millions in my time. You have access to information, art, and ideas from every culture and every era. The potential for love to spread, for justice to advance, for human flourishing to increase is greater than it's ever been. And yet, you're more divided than ever. You have the tools to solve hunger, homelessness, and disease, but you lack the will to use them because you can't agree on who deserves help. You have the ability to communicate across every barrier, but you use it primarily to argue with people who think differently than you do. You have access to infinite wisdom, but you choose to live in echo chambers that confirm what you already believe.
My message to today's world is the same message I brought 2,000 years ago, but it's more urgent now because the stakes are higher. Love one another.
Not love people who are easy to love, not love people who agree with you, not love people who look like you or vote like you or worship like you. Love one another, period. When I said love your enemies, I wasn't being naive about human nature. I was giving you the only strategy that actually works for breaking cycles of hatred and violence. Every time someone responds to hatred with more hatred, the cycle continues and intensifies. Every time someone responds to hatred with love, the cycle has a chance to break. You're living in a time when information travels faster than wisdom, when opinion spreads quicker than truth, when outrage gets more attention than compassion. But the antidote to all of this isn't better technology or smarter algorithms. It's the ancient practice of pausing before you respond, asking what love looks like in this situation, choosing to build up rather than tear down. I watch your political systems and see people more committed to defeating their opponents than to solving problems. I see religious communities more focused on being right than on being loving. I see families torn apart by ideological differences that matter far less than the relationships being destroyed over them. Where is the willingness to sacrifice being right for the sake of staying connected? The climate crisis, the refugee crisis, the inequality crisis, the mental health crisis, these aren't problems that technology alone can solve. They're problems that require human beings to care about each other's well-being more than their own comfort. They require people to make sacrifices for the sake of future generations, to choose long-term flourishing over short-term gain. But here's what gives me hope. I see it happening everywhere, often in ways that don't make headlines. I see teachers spending their own money on supplies for students whose families can't afford them. I see neighbors caring for elderly people who have no family nearby. I see strangers organizing to help communities hit by natural disasters. I see young people passionate about justice, peace, and caring for creation. What I want people to understand is that the kingdom of heaven isn't primarily about what happens after you die. It's about how heaven's values can transform earth right now. When you forgive someone who's hurt you, heaven touches earth. When you share resources with someone in need, heaven touches earth. When you choose peace over conflict, inclusion over exclusion, hope over despair, heaven touches earth. Stop waiting for someone else to make the world better. Stop waiting for the right politician, the right technology, the right circumstances. You have everything you need to start transforming your corner of the world right now. The ability to love, to forgive, to serve, to include, to hope, to persist in doing good even when it's difficult. Your generation has been given unprecedented power, the power to communicate globally, to move resources quickly, to organize for change at scales that were impossible before. But with great power comes great responsibility. How are you using your influence? Are you amplifying voices of love or voices of hatred? Are you contributing to solutions or just complaining about problems? The loneliness epidemic, the anxiety epidemic, the depression epidemic, these are all symptoms of disconnection. People were created for relationship, with each other, with creation, with divine love. When those connections are broken or superficial, souls wither. Social media can facilitate connection, but it can't replace the deep, vulnerable, committed relationships that human beings need to thrive. Practice presence. Put down your phones and look into each other's eyes. Listen not just to respond, but to understand. Ask questions not to trap people, but to learn about their experiences. Slow down enough to notice beauty, to appreciate simple pleasures, to recognize the sacred in the ordinary. Most importantly, remember that you're loved beyond your ability to comprehend. Not because of what you achieve or how good you are, but because love itself decided you were worth creating, worth dying for, worth spending eternity with. That knowledge should free you from the desperate need to prove your worth through accomplishments, possessions, or other people's approval. When you know you're beloved, you can love others freely. When you know you're forgiven, you can offer forgiveness generously. When you know you're secure in divine love, you can take risks for justice and peace without needing to protect yourself first. The world doesn't need more people who are right about everything. It needs more people who are willing to love everyone. Be those people.
That call to be people who love everyone rather than people who are right about everything, that's a perfect way to end our time together. Jesus, what are your final words for anyone listening to this conversation?
My final words. They're the same words I spoke to my disciples the last time I saw them before my ascension, but they carry even more meaning after everything we've shared tonight. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I know that might sound like a platitude, something comforting but not particularly practical, but I need you to understand what with you actually means. It means that right now, as you're listening to this conversation, I'm not just aware of you, I'm present with you. I know your name, your circumstances, your struggles, your dreams, your fears, your secret shame, your hidden hopes. When you lie awake at 3 a.m., worried about your marriage, your health, your children, your finances, I'm there in that worry with you, not as someone who judges your lack of faith, but as someone who holds your fear while offering you peace. When you celebrate your victories, your breakthroughs, your moments of joy, I'm there celebrating with you, delighting in your happiness. When you fail, when you disappoint yourself and others, when you do the things you swore you'd never do again. I'm there not to condemn but to remind you that failure doesn't define you, that shame doesn't have the final word, that love is always stronger than your worst moments. I'm with you in your questions and doubts. You don't have to pretend to be more certain than you are, more spiritual than you feel, more together than your life actually is. I'm with you in the mess, in the confusion, in the seasons when nothing makes sense and God feels absent, even when you can't sense my presence, especially when you can't sense my presence. I'm there. If you've never thought of yourself as religious, if you've been hurt by churches or turned off by Christians, if you think faith is for people who aren't as smart or educated or sophisticated as you are, I'm still with you. I'm with you in your skepticism, in your honest questioning, in your refusal to accept easy answers to complex problems. Truth isn't threatened by investigation. If you've been carrying guilt about things you've done or shame about things that were done to you, if you've been living under the weight of secrets that you think would horrify people if they knew, I know, and I'm still here. There's nothing you could tell me that would make me love you less. There's no sin too big for forgiveness, no damage too severe for healing, no person too far gone for redemption. If you're exhausted from trying to be good enough, successful enough, spiritual enough, worthy enough, you can stop trying. You're already enough. You've always been enough. The love that created you isn't conditional on your performance. It's the foundation everything else is built on, not the reward you have to earn. If you're angry at God, if you blame Him for tragedies and suffering, if you think He's been silent when you needed Him to speak, bring that anger to me. I can handle your rage, your disappointment, your accusations. Some of the most honest prayers in Scripture are arguments with God. I'd rather have your authentic anger than your polite indifference. For those of you who do follow me but feel like you're failing at it most of the time, you're in good company. Peter denied me, Thomas doubted me, all of them abandoned me when things got difficult, but they're remembered not for their failures but for their love, their growth, their willingness to keep following despite their imperfections. Your value to me isn't based on your spiritual performance. If you're facing death, your own or someone you love, remember that death is not the end of the story. It's not even the end of the chapter. Love transcends every boundary, including the boundary between life and death. Grief is real and necessary, but it's not permanent. The separation is temporary, but the love is eternal. Here's what I want you to do when this conversation ends. Look for me in the people around you. I'm in the homeless person asking for help, the coworker who annoys you, the family member who drives you crazy, the stranger who needs kindness. When you serve them, you're serving me. When you love them, you're loving me. When you forgive them, you're participating in the work I came to do. Don't wait until you feel ready, until you understand everything, until your life is in order. Start where you are, with what you have, in whatever circumstances you're facing. I specialize in working with imperfect people in imperfect situations to create perfect love. My invitation is simple. Come as you are. Bring your doubts, your fears, your anger, your shame, your dreams, your questions. Bring your need for forgiveness and your struggle to forgive. Bring your loneliness and your desire for connection. Bring your exhaustion and your hunger for rest. Bring everything and leave it all with me. I am with you in the sunrise that takes your breath away and in the darkness that makes you afraid. I'm with you in the laughter that makes your sides ache and in the tears that feel like they'll never stop. I'm with you in your greatest triumphs and in your most devastating failures. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You will never be alone. That's not a promise about the future. That's the reality of right now. Open your heart and feel the love that has been surrounding you your entire life, waiting for you to notice, to receive, to rest in its perfect embrace. I am with you always, always.
And there we have it, 2 hours with Jesus of Nazareth, the man behind the miracles, the human heart behind the divine mission. What strikes me most is how his love for humanity hasn't diminished after 2,000 years, how his understanding of our struggles comes from having lived them himself. Whether you're falling asleep to this conversation or listening with wide-awake wonder, I hope you've heard something that speaks to your soul. In a world that often feels divided by religion, politics, and countless other barriers, his message remains beautifully simple. You are loved, you are not alone, and love really is stronger than anything that stands against it. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Tea with Tyrants and Heroes. Next week, we'll be travelling back through time once again to share tea with another mysterious figure from history, someone whose story will surprise you in ways you never expected. Until then, sleep well, knowing that you are held by love that transcends time itself.